found, more so in my last few years in government, was that there seems to be a real reluctance to reaching out and building, not building like a formal relationship with a community, but building relationships with folks that care about the issues and that are thinking about these issues, and just going out and having a conversation, much like we are, and just bouncing ideas off each other, like not making any commitments, but trying to figure out, like, how do we come up with workable solutions, and obviously not everybody's always going to be happy about the result. I think somewhere along the lines, something, and at least here in the Yukon, that kind of collaboration has disappeared. So we're kind of talking about whether it's salmon or mining or forestry. We kind of created this sort of us and them kind of relationship, and it really hinders collaborative thinking.
Welcome to the Co-Management Commons podcast. My name is Jamie Snook. I am your podcast host, and I have been working in and with Indigenous communities for over 20 years now. I am joined in this podcast by some of the leading practitioners, researchers, elders, and community members from this sector, where we discuss co-management in Canada with Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. Please check out the show notes, where we always share lots of other resources. And in between episodes, your feedback is always encouraged and appreciated. So thank you very much once again, and take care. Welcome, Lawrence, to the Co-Management Commons podcast, and really grateful that you would give us your time this afternoon to have a conversation about co-management and bridging different knowledge systems. And I always like to start off the podcast with people sharing their positionality and where they're from and different influences that they've had in their life and they bring to their work.
Great. Bojo Nijiba Madazik, Lord Ignis Nisnikaz, Miskumin, Nishtave Mong, Maquad, Nitudam, and Whitehorse Ninda. So, yeah, my name is Lord Ignace. I grew up in Ignace, Ontario, but I belong to a Lac First Nation in Treaty 3 in Northwestern Ontario, and I grew up in that area. The town of Ignace actually is named after my great-grandfather. He helped guide Sir Sanford Fleming across Treaty 3, and because of the relationship they developed, they named the town after him. And yeah, so my family has a pretty long history of living in that area. Some of my relatives, like my Gokum, my grandmother, she's from the Mission in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And then I guess probably about 150 years ago, Lac was flooded out, and it caused everybody to move. They do have some like summer cottages on the reserve, but nobody officially lives in the community because everyone got pushed out, and a lot of folks are either living in Thunder Bay or Kenora or kind of all over Northwestern Ontario. Our family decided to move to so there used to be an old train track that ran between Thunder Bay and Sulikout, and I think it was mostly for shipping of lumber back in the day, and they kind of they found a place that's called Souden, and it's really just it's not really, now the train track has gone there, it's not really recognized any longer. But my mom had a trap line there. She just recently passed away a couple of years ago, and my Gokup had a trap line. So a lot of my family is trying to reconnect with that area, and so watched a lot of changes happen in Northwestern Ontario, such as loss of, because of forestry, the pushing north of caribou. So much forestry that in Ontario that of merchantable wood, they had to shut it down for probably about 5 years just to, I guess, reset that cycle, how they manage. And Ignace probably has a lot of infrastructure for a small little town, because there was a iron ore nickel mine, the Matabi mine, that ran for, I believe, 13 or 15 years. And then when it shut down, it had really detrimental effects on the town of Ignace. I remember being in high school, and all of a sudden the biology class, and all of a sudden we heard this gigantic boom, and somebody in the sort of like the mining complex, just because of how much it impacted them, they blew themselves up. And so learned a lot from growing up in small little town in Northwestern Ontario.
Thank you for that. And I'm sorry about the loss of your mom. I could tell I was on your website, and you had a really beautiful tribute to her, and very obvious that she was influential and had a big impact on a lot of people, I would say, in her community and was in her family. And now today you're working in the Yukon, is that correct? What brought you north, I guess? Well, I know Thunder Bay, a lot of people would say that's north too. I guess you're going further north now in the Yukon.
Yeah, growing up in a small little town, it's quite sheltered. So I decided to go to school in York University. So I moved to York, and I got a degree in geography, and continued to work for the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources for some time. And then my first real job was actually with Environment Canada in Iqaluit, and I was doing environmental assessment there for a little while. And then the management was in Yellowknife, and I was in Iqaluit, and there was a lot of differences in how things. Well, in my mind, I really wanted to do some work with communities. So I really wanted to work for instance, with Sandy Kiluak, and they had an environment committee, and I really wanted to support their efforts. But the management had a different opinion at that time. So I moved back down to Ontario, and I moved to the Assembly First Nations. So I managed their environment secretariat for a number of years, and through that work, really met a lot of thinkers and a lot of First Nations thinkers from across Canada, like Deb McGregor, Rod Whitlow, Chris Patchy, and I ran into the friend that brought me up to Whitehorse, or to the Yukon. His name is Brian McDonald. He's a lawyer with the Champion-Ajac First Nation. And we worked on the Species at Risk Act for probably about 4 years together. And then our friendship really didn't happen until we ended up in Geneva together at the at WIPO, so the World Intellectual Property Organization. And we were both there to talk about copyright and intellectual property rights in respect to traditional knowledge. So, and then, we've been friends ever since. And he convinced me to come up and give the Yukon a try. So I moved up here about 15 years ago.
I was going to ask actually about your time at York. I was curious if you had worked with Dr. Deborah McGregor. She's I know her well, and she's a friend of our podcast. She's been on, and she's been in the course that I teach as well. But did you do any collaboration with her when you were actually at York?
So she presented in my first year. I started off in environmental studies, and then later switched to geography. But she presented my first year class, and so she was just, I think, finishing or had a position at U of T at that time. So that's when I first got introduced to Deb. But later, when I worked at Environment Canada, I went down from Iqaluit to Toronto for a workshop, and she was putting on a workshop. This is when she was working at Environment Canada as well, on environmental management and building toolkits for First Nations in Ontario. And I was trying to collaborate and see if we can adapt that toolkit to working with Sandy Kiluak, hopefully providing with some capacity. So, and ever since then, I've been friends with Deb for quite a long time now. Yeah, we seem to have crossed paths. Yeah, she's actually on my supervisorial committee for my PhD. So, yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. Oh, yeah. Okay, excellent. Yeah, why don't we talk about that for a second? And with all of your experience, I'm really curious to kind of understand, what spurred you on to do your PhD after all of the years of experience that you had working within government. And I think I'm really interested to see how all your research unfolds, because I think it's unique and probably not the norm when people enter into PhD programs after a lot of public policy experience like you have. So what's the story there that led you to want to do that?
Yeah, no, I've done a lot of work in different areas, mostly all in the environmental field. So you kind of, after a period of time, you kind of get a sense of how government systems work, and if you're in it, how to move things through the process, which often takes quite a bit of time. For instance, like the Species at Risk Act that the government of Canada proposed back in 2000, or got approved back in 2004, was about 7 years in the making. So even before I started on it, there was already a national committee that was working on that, and it was originally just supposed to be a guideline. So they were supposed to just produce guidelines on how to protect and conserve species at risk, but due to political pressure, it moved into sort of, let's develop legislation. And then they engaged with the national Aboriginal organizations, so Assembly First Nations, Inuit like VK540, and the Métis National Council, as well as the Native Women's Association and Congress of Aboriginal Peoples. So we kind of all sat at a table for quite a number of years, and you really kind of got an inside look in terms of. And I think at that point in time, back in the early 2000s, it was quite innovative, where federal government departments were sitting down with national Aboriginal organizations to try to draft legislation, or at least components of it, and once we had the legislation, then we were sort of tasked with creating the National Aboriginal Council on Species at Risk, and the Aboriginal Traditional Knowledge Subcommittee for COSEWIC. So yeah, we embarked upon creating those terms of reference. There's a lot of interest now about trying to learn from Indigenous knowledge, and what are the facets of Indigenous knowledge that can improve how we're managing resources and conservation now. And so I think back then that really kind of gave me some insight in terms of, because at the crux of the issue for the longest time was a lot of the departments around the table couldn't really wrap their minds around putting in traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge on the same level, and how could you do that? And we discussed that for like 4 years, and finally, where we ended up is what you see in terms of the Species at Risk Act, which is really kind of, it's still community controlled. So we need to have a liaison that works with community to sort of bring that knowledge into the assessment process. But yet still there's a group of experts sitting at the table, and they try to incorporate traditional knowledge to the best of their ability. And unfortunately, and you're mentioning my work, I'm really trying to turn that on its head, right? So our systems probably need to be redesigned to better allow for Indigenous knowledge to be more equitable, or even the more central part of how decisions are being made. And obviously, Indigenous knowledge systems are far more than just ecological or baseline information. It actually speaks to Indigenous identity and Indigenous existence. It speaks to governance systems. It speaks to the relationships in which Indigenous peoples have developed over thousands of years. And the most important component is that most Indigenous cultures don't see themselves as more important than nature. And unfortunately, the systems that we have managing nowadays are the reverse. And how do we try to balance that out so we will have a future? So yeah.
Yeah. So with all of that sort of context, I guess was the idea that the PhD time and the study time would give you kind of a space to kind of think about all these things in a dedicated way for a period now, and then I'm sure you'll be entering back into all of these spaces because I know you're very active. So
yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. Like I just had my 52nd birthday 2 days ago, and And it kind of gives you some time to reflect and think about how you got here. And it's pretty amazing. I think though, my thinking has always been, I really like, and probably much like how Indigenous resilience and survival came to be, right? Like you kind of, I like that idea. I like that idea. And so as I, for instance, at first I got introduced to cumulative effects when I started working with Environment Canada and the Iqaluit. I think the Nunavut land claim came into place in 1999, and I moved there in 2000. So we were really, it was a super exciting time to be there because we were just building things, and I think the cumulative effects conversation was just starting in Northwestern NWT with caribou. So I was really kind of keeping an eye on that, and I always really interested in, like, the world is very complex. The ecological systems are very complex. How do we frame our mind and thinking more broadly to because when you destroy a stream, for instance, you're not just destroying that crossing, you're destroying potentially fish habitat, invertebrate habitat, vegetation. You're removing components of that ecological system, not only within that space, but potentially downstream. And how does those impacts affect the watershed as a whole? And obviously, that watershed is connected to other systems. So I think sometimes our systems, like in particular environmental assessment, is quite narrow, and it's probably reflective of our limitations ourselves, of how we think about and how we can conceptualize the world. And so Indigenous knowledge, they sees these interactions and has learned from them and incorporates them in terms of how we treat and are accountable for the world. So I'm really about how do we broaden our understanding, probably take a more precautious approach in terms of our decision making, and trying to really kind of understand what are the longer term impacts of not only what we've done in the past, but what we're doing now, and potentially what we're going to do in the future. And I think that framework comes from, or it's very similar to how cumulative effects in its probably its fullest form was supposed to be conceived. And over time, it's kind of really narrowed, in part because, as I was mentioning, how we think about the world, and in particular science, it's very narrow focused, very objective, and where we kind of dominate, or our mindset dominates, like we're able to manage things. And realistically, that's not, as we're learning with climate change and biodiversity loss, that's not really how these larger systems are working.
Did you happen to come across any of Dr. Carrie Staples' work? I know she's based in Whitehorse there, and she was on the podcast. And I know in her PhD work, she looked at cumulative effects as well in the Yukon Territory, and remember having a real good conversation with her about that.
Oh, great. I've read a little bit of her work, and it was more really geared to how cumulative effects is captured or not captured in some instances in the land claims agreements in the Yukon. I think it's super interesting because it's probably one of those boundary spanning kind of concepts, that because when the land claims were written, that was 20, 30 years ago, and it kind of captures that kind of thinking. And as we're both aware, systems change, both political, economic, and ecological and social. And I think at times, like the co-management relationships and boards are kind of stuck in sort of that thinking 20, 30 years ago, and are struggling in some instances, like land use planning, to how do we evolve with the concepts of like cumulative effects and land use planning, and obviously the external impacts of biodiversity loss and climate change. So I think there's a lot of challenges ahead, I think, and in Yukon in particular, because also we're seeing population growth, not huge population growth, but the systems here are quite sensitive, and any sort of impacts have lasting effects, right? So, like you can, for instance, in the Columbia National Park, you can see where old military vehicles have crossed the tundra, and that was probably 40, 60 years ago, and those marks are still right in the tundra, and will probably always be there. That will never change. So, yeah, it's I haven't read anything recent. I know she is collaborating with so Yukon is putting in a near proposal. So she's involved with that. And then I did present to one of her classes at one time. Yeah.
Yeah, the near networks are very valuable. I know in our neck of the woods, we've been really fortunate to receive some funding from the Wabanaki Labrador Health Network, and we're studying the impacts of land-based education on Inuit youth health and well-being. So hopefully you'll be successful with the near in the Yukon as well. And I was really interested to talk to you about one part of your CV where you were a senior negotiator at one point for the Yukon government. And I don't know all the context, obviously, but I'd love to explore that a little bit and learn more about what your role was there, and just with your own positionality. What was that like, negotiating on behalf of the territory, and what kind of complexities does that probably bring up?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to one of your earlier questions in terms of what sort of brought me back into academia. I think partly with some of my experiences there were kind of why I came back to, is that so in that role, my primary responsibility was to negotiate with local First Nations about the roads to resources. So the Yukon government from the federal government got a substantial amount of money to build. It was called the Gateway Project. So help improve a lot of the resource roads we have in the Yukon to allow for potentially in the future mining. And so we basically we had I can't remember exactly how much, but approximately about $350 million to spend on road upgrades, and I think the intention was good. We engaged with probably quite a few First Nations, and one of the earlier topics that were on the table was actually cumulative effects, and it was really kind of where the Yukon is at with the cumulative effects. So that it's really kind of from that sort of 6-step process where it's kind of the traditional sort of conventional model of cumulative effects, and how are the self-governing First Nations in this instance, or some majority of them, would engage in that model with Yukon government to help improve or help develop these roads, and then there was some small economic benefits that would result from these improvements to these roads. And it really kind of opened my eyes in our conversations with Little Sam McCarmack's in particular, because the timing was right around the same time as the Blueberry First Nations case in British Columbia. And Little Sam McCarmack's is working with the same law firm that Blueberry First Nation was working with. And then their negotiator basically took one look at our agreement that we were hoping to reach with Little Sam McCarmack's, and they said the person just basically said, this is nowhere near what we'd be looking for in terms of cumulative effects in an agreement. And that kind of really opened my eyes to that there's more to be uncovered and investigated. And and then just in terms of governments are there to make decisions for the benefit of all, and they try to balance things the best they can, and in terms of Indigenous interests, Indigenous rights, and often that just gets weighed against the betterment, the good for all, for the betterment for all, and that often it doesn't necessarily take a more progressive look forward. And how can we bring those two interests together in a more beneficial way? And obviously politicians are really there for 3 or 4 years, or at least that's the extent of their thinking. And so I think it's a real challenge when you're in a system and you see opportunities beyond your mandate that could be beneficial to all Yukoners or all Canadians, and you're really kind of hamstrung. And then around that time too, we had some success with publishing the 10 calls to action towards reconciliation 10 calls to action for national scientists working in Canada, and it really kind of also opened my eyes to there's another world out there where you can influence decisions from outside of the system, and in a lot of ways it's quite a bit more effective, I found. So, and it allows you to think about these ideas and concepts on a much grander scale, and experiment and work with them, and meet people like yourself, Jamie, and how do we move this thinking forward to better help make better decisions in the future. Yeah. And nothing against government or politicians. They have a very important role to play, but I think sometimes they get stuck in the issues, just like we all do in our day-to-day lives, and aren't always able to think or granted the time to think beyond where they're at in that particular issue. So yeah, and in academia, you get that flexibility.
Yeah, no, you do, and I know when I did my research and PhD, it was humbling. I think I was naive to how much work it was. So I definitely gained a new appreciation for what was kind of out there on the academic side of things. And prior to that, I guess I would often question, why are things the way they are when we're dealing with a graduate student or a postdoctoral fellow or a professor. But I can see now how those systems are very different as well. And like you said, the government systems are very different. I wasn't familiar with the Blueberry River First Nation court case, but just had a quick look while we were chatting, and that seems to be a very substantive decision that I could see will have impacts in the future for sure. Maybe you could summarize just succinctly for listeners the impact of the decision.
It's quite a substantial decision. So I think Blueberry River First Nation is kind of in the northeast corner of British Columbia, and they've seen now over the last and they document it really well, and they work with some NGOs to do that, and you can find that online. And they've kind of developed a model where they've shown the impacts spatially over the last 50 years, just due to oil and gas development, forestry, and mining claims, and the loss of access to traditional foods, and the loss of access to hunting and other Indigenous rights or First Nations rights, and it's quite powerful. So that the analysis actually shows that in around their whole traditional territory, the impacts are only in any given area anywhere within 350 or 500 meters, there's an impact from wherever you position yourself. So that was one side of their argument, right? And the main part of it is that the BC government had been approving all this development while not adequately or meaningfully considering the impacts on their rights. And that's been happening for probably 50 years. So they won that court case, and basically the court basically put everything in an injunction for a period of time, and ordered the BC government to enter into negotiations to establish an agreement as to how development is meant to occur in their traditional territory, not only from a cumulative effects perspective, but also impact on their rights. So effectively, trying to ensure that their not only their rights, but their knowledge and their uses and is incorporated into future decision making. So yeah.
You mentioned also a paper that you were one of the collaborators on with the calls to action for natural scientists. And I really like that paper, and I like sharing it in the co-management course that I offer. But I was even more impressed recently by the Signal Fire film. And that to me is a whole new next level now of knowledge mobilization with the documentary itself and all of the case studies that you have on the website and stuff. And really curious to hear more about all of those initiatives. I think they're great, but really curious to know a little bit more, I guess, of the backstory of who your team of collaborators are on that, and how you decided to mobilize it that way with film and so on.
Yeah, no. So the paper itself came from. So my partner in life, Carmen Wong, is the management ecologist within Kalani Park, and then obviously they're in a co-management relationship with Kalani First Nation and Champion and Ajax First Nation, and to some extent White River First Nation, and so there's, and because the ecological and geological and there's a significant importance to Kalani Park. It's like the largest inland ice field in Canada, and there's lots of, if you ever get a chance, you should visit Kalani Park. It's gorgeous. But also because of all of that importance, it attracts a lot of researchers. And it is right within Kalani First Nation, in particular's traditional territory, and there's been a lot of work over with land claims, but also in terms of how do we ensure that researchers are doing are engaging with communities and ensuring that communities' interests and what they want to see research is also reflected in the work that's happening in Kalani Park and the Yukon. So the paper kind of comes from a place of frustration, even though there's been all these efforts to try to ensure that researchers are doing their work in an ethical and equitable manner, but some of them aren't. And so the co-authors all kind of came around. Came together around their frustration with how there's still some researchers out there that aren't engaging with Indigenous communities in the way that communities want to be engaged with. So we decided to develop the 10 calls to actions paper, and and then just by coincidence, we were actually asked from somebody from Natural Resources Canada, and they read the paper and they said, you should make this into a film. And not only they said that you can make it into a film, they funded it. So it was her name is Sophie Silva, and she has since retired, but we always ensure that we recognize her and coming up with such an amazing idea, and also fighting within their Natural Resources Canada system to make sure it's funded. So it's quite an amazing piece. So there's Carmen Wong. She's is Dr. Carmen Wong. She graduated from UBC. She's an expert in white bark pine, but also now an expert in developing monitoring processes in the colonic park. So kokanee salmon, Dall sheep, forestry. They have some toads they monitor and vegetation and so in the summertime I really struggle to spend time with her because she basically spends her whole time monitoring everything all summer long. And then also I met through this process Heidi Swanson. So she's now a professor at Sir Wilfrid Laurier University, and she's an aquatic toxicologist and does work all across the north. And I think right now she's in the process of building a lab in Yellowknife. So, and then I also work with Heidi in other capacities. So I used to be the executive director for the Arctic Institute for Community-Based Research, and worked with Norma Cassie, and they had a really strong relationship with Kalani First Nation. And one of the case studies, I think, and was really influential, not only in the Yukon, but also in some other parts of Canada, was the one project that he did around Lake Whitefish, and trying to figure out whether they're safe to eat, was bringing of some of the young members of Kalani First Nation down to at that point the University of Waterloo to learn how these processes actually happen and what's all entailed in terms of doing toxicology, and then reporting back. So those young members actually reported back to the council in Kalani First Nation. And I think projects like that really kind of changing the landscape in terms of how research is being done in the Yukon in particular. And from there, I think Kalani First Nation has started a project called Bringing Research Home, and where they kind of host annual or semi-annual research summits to try to bring researchers together and also share and also ensure that Kalani's interest in research are being communicated to these researchers. So in the future that they're going to be developing joint interests and joint projects, and so I think there's been a lot of successes around the movie and the paper, but also I think Kalani First Nation themselves are actually moving a lot of this stuff forward in a really good way. And then I'm also working with Kalani First Nation in terms of my PhD work. So yeah. Oh, sorry. Before I forget, there's two more co-authors, and so Mary Jane Johnson, or Gudia, is her traditional name, and she's a pretty well respected elder within Kalani First Nation, and super active. I work with her on Braiding Knowledges Canada, or previously Canadian Mountain Network, and then Kate Balgonian. I'm forgetting her married name now, and she has since left Kalani First Nation, so she's in Winnipeg now, and working for a consultancy there. So yeah, while her husband goes back to school. So yeah.
Oh, okay. And you mentioned somebody, Sophie, with Natural Resources Canada. Well, I didn't catch her last name. I know you just said she's retired, but
Silva. So Silwa. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, no, I really appreciate you giving a shout out to Sophie Silwa, because what a great example of an ally, clearly, within the federal service. And I know there's many of them, and they often don't get many shout outs or whatnot, because we kind of lump government in this big monolith that it is. But that's a really great shout out and story to mobilize a paper like that and fund it, and obviously saw the importance of the work.
You're listening to a special Yukon edition of the Co-Management Commons podcast, supported by Yukon University and UArctic. The podcast is produced by Cloudberry Connections and hosted by Jamie Snook in collaboration with Curie Staples and David Silas.
Yeah, and you just mentioned as well Braiding Knowledges Canada. Congratulations on being a part of that project and the recent funding. And why don't we share with listeners what Braiding Knowledges Canada is and your role within that. But I know it's going to have a big impact in the years to come with research. But it's a good opportunity to share some more information about it.
Yeah. So Braiding Knowledges Canada is building upon the successes that the Canadian Mountain Network had established. So the Canadian Mountain Network was a network of excellence in research, or the NCE, National Center of Excellence. And that was previously funded by NSERC. But that program sort of came to the end. It actually just ended March 2024. So Canadian Mountain Network was in existence for about 4 years and received about $18 million over that 4-year term to actually braid Western and Indigenous knowledge. In its earlier phases, it supported 3 modes of research. One was very, very much Western science, and then a second mode was co-led research. So there would be often a Western scientist and an Indigenous community or Indigenous researcher. And then the third mode was purely Indigenous-led research. So it's very unique. I don't think there has been a previous organization of that nature. And so we did a lot of learning over that course of time. And our research changed or what we funded. So the last few years we focused strictly on co-led research, and Indigenous-led research, and we ended up with quite a few really amazing projects, and supported mostly in the mountains, unfortunately. But because we were so successful and demonstrated basically the power of being an enabler. So presenting research funding in a way that's more accessible and equitable for communities to access. So we funded everything from supporting governance, like in the Atlan, for instance. They're trying to uplift their governance system and incorporate language and Indigenous knowledge into decision making. So that's just one example. And then we also supported work in southern Alberta, where they're reintroducing bison back into a national park. And so we funded a whole range of as well as climate change and biodiversity projects, and I think we also funded some work that Jamie you were doing. It was pretty amazing. We did a lot of learning. So we even my role in the organization. Right now I am the vice chair, so I support the chair in terms of at the board level. I'm also on the research management. On the research management committee, and chair of the Indigenous Circle of Advisors. So within the organization, I wear a lot of different hats. And my research is also being supported by was supported by the Canadian Mountain Network as well. So, but I'm super involved and super supportive of it, because I think one thing is unique, but it's also I think obviously a very innovative way of working with Indigenous communities, and ensuring that they can be not only have access to funding, but also access to building capacity and access to researchers and different ways of doing it. So yeah, and so I think there's a lot of really amazing things that are going to be coming out. Like, for instance, one thing that I'm working on is Indigenous Methods Learners Network. So where students and learners from both inside and outside academia can learn about Indigenous methods and how do we bring, or kind of asking the question, like, how do we bring Indigenous methods into science? And so, because often there's been a lot of work been done in the social science fields, and now that's sort of, we need to sort of help bridge that into science. And so that's something that Braiding Knowledges Canada. So we're sort of just transitioning from closing the doors on Canadian Mountain Network, and now becoming Braiding Knowledges Canada. And so we're re-engaging with the knowledge hubs. So we previously funded 7 knowledge hubs, and we're re-engaging with them. And then once we've figured that out, then there'll be new funding calls in the fall for knowledge hubs, as well as land-based learning opportunities and knowledge mobilization. And so we're trying to hit the ground running, and making sure that there's a lot more work to be done. And obviously the mandate expanded quite a bit, so we're working all across Canada. So and we actually have a relationship that we hope to expand with ArcticNet. So we're also going to be working with ArcticNet to engage with more Inuit communities, but also we're also have a relationship. We're developing a more fulsome relationship with the Assembly of First Nations and the Métis National Council as well. So
yeah, no, I was a big fan of the Canadian Mountain Network. We were certainly very grateful to get research funding to do work in the Mealy Mountains area with Inuit from Rigolet, and reintroducing people to traditional caribou grounds that haven't legally been able to be hunted now for many, many decades, unfortunately. But really wanting to put an emphasis on cultural continuity. One of the big things that I'm starting to be more and more worried about is, and a lot of my thinking lately has been influenced by Dr. Deborah McGregor as well, and the risk and the loss of Indigenous knowledge systems. So a lot of people in Labrador right now haven't even seen a caribou for many years, right? So, and unfortunately the herds aren't repopulating as quickly as everybody would like. But we want to sort of take initiatives to at least get people reconnected to where the caribou grounds are, and keep things fresh. And as we speak, actually, there's a group who left Nain, the Natsiavut, today, and are making their way into the Torngat Mountains, a group of youth and elders, and we're in the process of documenting it. And the hope is that they're going to find the caribou and harvest it and bring it back to the community and celebrate it. And I'm really happy with that prospect, because the idea of an abrupt hunting ban has really been tough on a lot of people here, and it created a lot of division, unfortunately. So, no, a big fan. I look forward to seeing what you all now accomplish with Braiding Knowledges Canada, for sure.
No, we're all super excited. And we have 2 co-research directors. So Murray Humphreys with the University of McGill, and Paulina Johnson with the University of Alberta. So yeah. And so they really work well as a team, and are supporting lots of new initiatives, and we have some new impact connectors that we're, like, one of them will be obviously cumulative effects, and then we're looking at it in our biodiversity impact connector, and so there's lots of exciting things. So I encourage people to reach out and engage with us. So look for opportunities in the near future.
Yeah, I was in Ottawa this past fall, and your executive director and your chair were making representation at a standing committee there of Parliament, and they definitely were very effective, I felt, and did a good job, and we're certainly educating that committee on science. So it was nice to see, and it was just prior to the announcement, I think. So it was well timed. Yeah, I'm just going to take a quick break for a second, Lawrence. We've been chatting for about an hour, and I don't even think I've asked you about co-management. Yeah, maybe I could ask you just one or two questions about how your career has intersected with some of the co-management boards in the Yukon or in Iqaluit and Nunavut, Northwest Territories. I don't think I'm making much of a leap, but I can imagine you must have intersected with a lot of the co-management boards at one point or another in some of these roles.
Yeah, a few of them. Yeah. In Nunavut, it was mostly the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, and because at that point in time, we were just there was a lot of interest in Nunavut for establishing a shellfish fishery, and so we were. Environment Canada was chairing a regional Canadian shellfish sanitation program committee, and so we were just sort of introducing people to the process, as well as seeking their input, and obviously how do we sort of. So the Canadian shellfish sanitation program at that time was really kind of designed for the Atlantic Canada and the BC coast, and then bringing it to the north obviously was a new challenge, and I learned a lot. Got beaten down at the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board quite a few times, which is just learning process. And then obviously they were also just trying to sort of establish themselves as well. So. But I think, and we were trying to support, and it's challenging too, because, not only was Environment Canada, we were mostly interested in the water quality aspects of shellfish, but also there is also the Department of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. So it also, we had to learn to collaborate amongst ourselves as well. So it was a really interesting learning experience. I haven't really reached back and figured out where that has gone, but I know that we did build a lab, and I think it's still there in Iqaluit. I think it was donated to the Arctic Research Institute, because I'm not sure that anybody picked up that process after we got it initiated. But it was super, super interesting. The other board that I was really kind of involved with is here in the Yukon. We have what they call is the Yukon Environmental Assessment or Environmental Socioeconomic Assessment Board, and Yukon very quite not super differently, but. So they set up the board to be sort of a third-party independent assessment board, and so they kind of appoint their board members, and some of them are Yukon government, some of them are federal government, and then Council of Yukon First Nations also appoints the members, and but they represent themselves and make and guide that organization. And it's kind of interesting. So they have a very decentralized model. So they'll have regions within the Yukon. So there'll be one in Whitehorse, one in Haines Junction, one in Dawson, one in Watson Lake, and then I think Dawson does sort of all of the north, so all the way up to North Old Crow, and regional offices. And the regional offices handle kind of the more standard environmental assessments, and then as things get more complex, they get bumped up to like regional or sort of white horse level kind of assessment, and then the upper level is called I think it's called comprehensive assessment, and then there's an executive council assessment, or so it's a board assessment, and then executive council assessment. It's about that, or a panel, the panel. So for instance, we have one project that could potentially be a panel, which is the casino mine, which kind of seems to be on the rails and sometimes off the rails. And back, I think right now we're kind of heading on the rails. So it'll probably be like I think probably one of the largest open pit gold mines in Yukon history. So yeah. And there I was I was working with the federal government as the I guess sort of the conduit for funding the Yukon YSAB, and then sort of working with them in terms of that relationship. But also I co-chaired we did a legislative review of it was supposed to be 5 years after the implementation, but it ended up being like 10 years after implementation, and then the 5 year, and then we were supposed to sort of do the review within a couple of years, and the review ended up being a review over 5 years, and so there was a lot of learning. I think the pretty amazing thing though is that in the Yukon, the First Nations really like to rely on each other, so they established sort of their own First Nations working group, and then it forced us as us as a federal government and the Yukon government to sort of work with them as we move things forward. So there was a lot of learning from that, and we produced a report with, I believe, something like 70 or 90 recommendations, and then we established the Yukon, what we called I believe like a forum, a practitioners forum, and we sort of worked through all the recommendations. So, and there was one specifically on heritage, and there was another specifically on cumulative effects and traditional knowledge.
Is the Yukon Practitioners Forum, is that specific to co-management, or is that a more broader group?
I think it would fall under it was time sensitive, so I'm not sure if it still exists, but I would think it would fall under an umbrella of co-management in terms of how we were basically developing policy together or informing how we would implement these recommendations. So yeah.
All right. Well, I know in a couple of weeks you're going to have a very captive audience of people working in the public service who last year many of them referred to themselves as wanting to be co-conspirators. So they're opting into a co-management program where they do want to learn about different knowledge systems and whatnot. And one of the things that I really noticed from all of our dialogue last year was people looking for tangible items and whatnot. Certainly the will is there in a lot of people, like the Sophie Silwas of the public service. So I just maybe we could end on this note, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what your message will be for this group when you speak in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think something I found more so in my last few years in government was that there seems to be a real reluctance to reaching out and building, not building like a formal relationship with a community, but building relationships with folks that care about the issues and that are thinking about these issues, and just going out and having a conversation, much like we are, and having and just bouncing ideas off each other, not making any commitments, but trying to figure out how do we come up with workable solutions, and obviously not everybody's always going to be happy about the result, but I think that's how, I think somewhere along the lines, something, and at least here in the Yukon, that kind of collaboration has disappeared. So we kind of talking about whether it's salmon or mining or forestry. We kind of created this sort of us and them kind of relationship, and it really hinders collaborative thinking and working together. So I think that's what I found when I was in particular negotiating, that we had to create a formal meeting with them and follow all this process, and then it, not only does it cost lots of money, but often it doesn't get you at the end of the day where you want to be. So how do we foster those kinds of conversations? I think I would probably ask them to help me think about what works, right? Like, you pointed to the Yukon. I can't remember exactly what we called it, but that collaborative where we brought everybody into one room and sort of really kind of hashed out these topics, and we set them up. So like, we kind of gave the state of the debate. What are some thinking around it, and then we kind of really made it super interactive to get there, to make sure we got everybody's input, and then we brought all that back together and tried to report back to people on how they felt and what could work and what couldn't work. And we brought all the players together. So yes, AB is often as a third party independent. Often sometimes gets excluded from the conversation. But in this process, we ensured that they were a part of the coordinating committee, and their thoughts were always brought through the whole process, because ultimately they were the implementer. The government still obviously retains authority in decision making, and the First Nations were really pushing for more authority in relationship to decision making, which is probably still, the attention's still there, but I think there was a lot of relationship building that I know still to this day. Like, I can still call up some folks and say, "What do you think of this?" and let's have a conversation. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's really what I'm hoping to create through the Cloudberry program and with co-management there's kind of three components of it, where we do have like self-paced modules, but then there is the Indigenous an expert speaker series that you're a part of, and but there's also an online community part. So I'm hoping we can create this community of practice of people that do care about Indigenous co-management and bridging knowledges and so on, and have a place where we can all collaborate. And that's one of the things that I've been finding a little bit frustrating over my career in the last 15 years in co-management, is that we have so much in common with all the other boards across the north, but we're a bit of a disjointed network. We don't have an association or a union or a forum that kind of brings us all together. So I'm hoping just through podcasts like this and through more awareness to education that we can sort of get some momentum and interest of people wanting to collaborate and share more ideas. And I've just been learning so much from the podcast alone that it's been invaluable and a great form of professional development. And I'm hoping more people will want to join us in it, because otherwise you can really get down into the weeds day to day with our work. And and it's nice to have other people on board with us when we're trying to figure some of these things out. But I really want to thank you for your time today. I know your time's really valuable when you're deep in thought with your studies. So thank you so much. And I don't know if you had any final comment that you'd want to make to sort of sum things up, but the floor is yours to end if you'd like.
Yeah, I know. I think what you're doing is pretty amazing, and I also have the reflection of I grew up and a lot of my training and experiences are from southern Canada, and often and I did have the one benefit of going north and then coming back, and then and often asking myself, like, why can't we do similar to what Nunavut did in Ontario, and I think the systems are just so ingrained, and politicians they're accountable, and they want a system that they can rely upon to ensure, and any sort of change to that is always going to be hard. But I think that there are opportunities, and I think that people should be really trying to investigate these opportunities and in small, even if they're in small ways, and how do we? Because there's some models in terms of I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Anishinaabe Fisheries Center in Ontario. I think it was established in the 90s. And so in Ontario, they have these lake assessment units. So they monitor sort of the big lakes like Lake Ontario and Lake Simcoe and Lake Superior. And then, but that was just for like commercial fishing and recreational fishing. But there was nothing really for First Nations and First Nations in terms of monitoring some of their interests in their lakes. So the Union of Ontario Indians, which is kind of situated in the center of Ontario, I'm not sure if they created it, but they obviously supported the establishment of the Anishinaabe Fisheries, which was kind of a blend of some of Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources biologists and First Nations biologists, and they created their own organization. I think they do get some funding from the Ontario government, but they also capitalize on species at risk funding and other conservation funding, and work with communities to do monitoring of their fisheries. So I think there's models like that really kind of are moving the conversation forward and demonstrating to these monstrous systems that Indigenous peoples do have a role to play. And I think, and now we're seeing that happen with Indigenous protected areas and land guardians. And so I think this Indigenous peoples repositioning themselves in this space is amazing. And I think we're just starting to see the tip of it. So yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much. And I hope this small collaboration between us gives us an opportunity now to have reasons to touch base more often, and certainly wish you luck in the final parts of your studies and so on. And I hope you take care.
Yeah, miigwech.
Thank you for listening to the full podcast. Please like the podcast, subscribe, and leave comments so we can connect. If you are interested in joining a dedicated Indigenous community of practice with many of Canada's leading practitioners and thinkers in this area, you can skip over and visit our website at www.co-management.ca. Getting signed up is easy, and professional development is a tangible and effective way to show your commitment to reconciliation